Nicodemus here. Our show for today is on the history of the course. I just want to know a little bit about it, how it came to be, and just fill me in.
Yeah, we'll give you a little bit of the history of it, and it's some of my own personal history with it too, because it's very fascinating in this day and age now to watch even the evolution of the course. For myself, I was introduced to it. I was really introduced to it at a young age. I would read quotes from the Course in Miracles and always go like, "What is that?" I love that quote. And then when I go to the bookstore and I pick the course up to read it, I'm like, "What the heck is?" Like I'm just open to the random part of the book. And I remember I'd opened to the text, and the text is very daunting. So the course is 3 books in one, and in the text, it's over 600, almost 700 pages. The text, and I must have at that time I would open it, and I can remember going like, "What the heck is that?" That didn't sound like that quote that I read, and I try to read some of it, but it didn't make any sense really. And it wasn't like I was new to spirituality because I was reading the gurus and all these, different people and teachers and all that stuff. And then in my 20s, I came around to it really deeply where I was through another book, supposedly that was somebody had mentioned A Course in Miracles. I said, you know what? I always wanted to really study it. Just a little bit of the background of the course. It's a channeled material, channeled work. And it's what I love about it so much is it was channeled by the most unlikely of channels. So Helen Schuckman, who was on the board of psychology, she was a clinical psychologist, like a researcher at Columbia. And she, up until she died in 1981, so for many years, she worked at Columbian Presbyterian Hospital and all throughout Manhattan. She grew up in Manhattan, and she had a partner actually who she was hired by was the head of the department, William Thetford. And so, I've read her autobiography, her life, and what I find so fascinating is very different than my background or even, I really feel fortunate that we have access to so much information, knowledge that they didn't back then. You're talking now in like the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, so like raised, not particularly religious parents, raised Jewish, but not really, they were Jewish, her parents. She wasn't really raised Jewish. She actually would ask them, like, what am I? She was fascinated with Catholicism, ended up also dabbling in Baptist, got baptized, fascinated with God, all that, and just is on a search and pretty much ends when she's young. And she turns from agnosticism to angry atheist or militant atheist. So now here she's total intellectual, extremely intelligent, grew up in New York City, so the edge of a New Yorker, has no, when I say no interest in any psychic or any woo-woo or any of that stuff at all. In fact, the way she describes it, almost repulsed, resistant, don't even bring it up around her. Okay, so you could just imagine now a classically trained clinical Freudian psychologist at Columbia in Manhattan. The most unlikely of characters, but the best of perfect character for this. So one of the things that starts happening to her, and I like these stories, so I want to just sidestep for a moment and tell a little bit about my own journey with it, because probably the first 10 years, almost 15 years of studying the course, I was never really that interested in Helen's life. I knew she was a scribe. Great, awesome, thanks for your gift. And the course, and I studied the course, lived it, practiced it, taught it, all that stuff. When it was 2015, I think it was, right around honeymoon time, marriage time, all that stuff. They came out with a new version of A Course in Miracles by the Circle of Atonement. Now, there was a lot of like scandal, which is so ironic because the course is all about peace, forgiveness, love, the ego, spirit, all of that. And yet all this conflict starts to show up around it, which makes sense because Helen, before she channeled the course, there was a lot of conflict in the department at Columbia. It was very competitive, they showed like videos probably in like the 80s, 70s of it, very fast paced, aggressive. Everybody was competitive, all that stuff. So it's not an accident or surprise that conflict showed up around the course and even the publication of it, because Helen's good friend, Ken Wapnick, who had her write her autobiography and helped support some of the edits, they ended up putting the course out through the Foundation of Inner Peace in New York. And I don't really love this part of the story, but I think it's important for anyone that's even interested in the course to know it, because it's part of the history. And it's not the pretty part of it, because Helen described it from 1965 to 1972, so 7 years. I'll tell you all about in a moment about how that came about, but why I'm sharing this to go back to before how this started happening for Helen. I'm sharing this because of my own experience. In 2015, the Circle of Atonement put out a new version, and the Circle of Atonement, Robert Perry and some of them at the Circle of Atonement discovered the course in the 80s, and they wanted Helen's original notes. And the Foundation for Inner Peace, Ken Wapnick and Helen were like, we should take this stuff out. So there was a lot of material on sex and some of Helen's personal life. They at the Circle of Atonement were like, well, we would like to read that. We'd like access to that. And Foundation for Inner Peace was like, we have the material. And no, it was Helen. And what their argument was like, well, even Helen herself was very challenged with the material. Why don't you let us, if this is all about the teaching of the Holy Spirit and all of that, and why don't you trust us to read the material and decipher for ourselves? They end up filing the lawsuit against Foundation for Inner Peace and taking it all the way to the Supreme Court and winning. Okay. Now I'm in a training years before. You're talking like 2013, before this version came out, and there was what's called the Urtext, which is the original Helen's notes, and there was all this stuff on sex and all this, and I was like, when I even read it, I mean, my stomach, I was like, oof, this is not in the original course, and now I have to decipher, do I trust this? Does Helen channeling, like, is this material supposed to be it? Are we really supposed to read this material? Is this material going to be confusing for us? And now 2015 comes out, and I get the Circle of Atonement book, and I end up reading it, and it was very well done. They took that Urtext, they edited some of it, like made it good. They even put in Bible quotes underneath on the bottom. They did a great job. And it's only the first 6 chapters of the course that were different. A lot of words on sex, almost 3,000, 3,500 words that they included in now. That original, I was studying the course for years and years, and now you bring in conversations around sex, and you're going, whoa, okay. Now, in the Circle of Atonement, they wrote these what's called cameos in the back. There's 33 of them. I saw them, and I never read them because I knew about this. It almost became a division, like Foundation, Inner Peace versus Circle of Atonement. Who are you going to listen to? Who's the direct? What's the real channel? Like, this is so perfect of the ego. And then fast forward many years later, it was like our dog had died, and all of a sudden, it was almost like I was moved by spirit. I opened this version of the Circle of Atonement to these cameos. It was a surreal experience. Like, I didn't consciously do it. I just found myself opening them and reading them because I got this book called One Course, Two Visions that they wrote saying, hey, we don't agree with Wapnick's interpretation of the course. We're not attacking him. We're just saying we have a different version. And in the beginning, I was like, I'm going to just stick with Wapnick because my teacher learned from Wapnick. And my teacher, I'd studied with them for years, but I started to know like their grasp on the course was pretty good, but they would say some stuff. I'm like, they didn't exactly say that like that. And now you have to understand, I've been studying now the course for years, reading every day. To this day, I still, maybe not every day, but I think about it all day, or it's like a running conversation now because I've read it for so long. Well, then these cameos took Helen's original notes and made commentary to them. When I started to read them, I went, whoa, it was so cutting edge from in my experience, because what I said was it was almost like if Course in Miracles was a movie, the cameos were like the TV show that they came out. Because I got a chance to see Helen in a way I really never saw her before, in her challenges, her struggles. I mean, she was resistant to the material almost the whole time of channeling for 7 years. I mean, you think about it, she like literally, now let's go back. So now an angry atheist, she has an experience on the train, okay, in, I think it was 1938. Now, she had some dreams, and things like that were interesting. She said she was very visual. She could close her eyes and see pictures of things. She has this experience on the train. She's describing it. She's a phenomenal writer. Wanted to be a world-class writer, but definitely brought that. It was great with shorthand, and you could see highly, highly intelligent. People don't even write like this anymore. She's on the train with her husband, and she just looks around, and everybody looks like disgusting and ugly and dirty. I mean, you could see in her writing that you're talking an angry New Yorker who was like very lonely as a child, older brother. Dad, I think, was on the spectrum as a chemist, very different, doesn't take any real notice to her. Her mom has her own life, very lonely. By the time, even in her autobiography, when she switches from phase 1 to phase 2, you could, or I think it was even by phase 3, you could just see she's like angry, just edgy, New York. And I grew up in that environment. I mean, I grew up outside of Manhattan, so I know that it's just very wound tight, very aggressive, resentful. She's on the train and she looking at just who's this? These guys arguing, and this child's putting chocolate on some mother's face, and it smells in the train, and all this. And she's sitting there, and she says, out of nowhere, she has this burst where it's this light. She sees this very strong light that she starts to go towards, and the light, she has her eyes closed. It hits her so hard that this light is of such strong, profound love that as she walks into the light, it's like everything turns to light. It's an overwhelming revelatory experience, which we later learn in the Course. Now, she knows nothing. And now she has no idea of mystical. We're talking 1938. In 1930, I mean, I would say Ramana Maharshi was the first like guru, really mystic, to make it. They did an article in Life magazine. That was in the 50s, let's say. Maybe you had Passage to India. People had heard of mystical experiences in India, but a lot of it was considered woo-woo. And, for a clinical Freudian psychologist, that was all weird, spooky, weird stuff. So they didn't really have any access to understanding this. They're trying to filter it through their psychological background. And why I'm sharing this, it really presences what happens to her later on. So she opens her eyes, and everyone on the train turns into like beautiful. And she grabs her husband's hands, and tries to tell him, like, I just had the craziest experience. And I'm like shaken by it. And he goes, oh, that was one of those are the mystical experiences. Don't even think about another thought. Yeah, they happen to people. Don't even think another thought about it. And she did it. She went back to her atheism and didn't have another real mystical experience for like decades. And then in 1965, the department's in shambles, or angry. They're getting good work done, but her and Bill Thetford are at each other. And Bill stands up one day in a meeting, almost like taken over by something, says, there's got to be another way here, and I'm determined to find it. And Helen was going to quit Columbia, and she just goes, I'll get behind. I'm going to help you find it too. Now, what Helen later called the voice says that was the beginning of their holy relationship, the holy instant. That's in July of 1965. Now, from July to October, all this crazy stuff starts happening to her. She starts having psychic experiences where she can predict things that are going to happen, and she's freaked the heck out by it. So, like, for instance, Bill would be on vacation and she would describe where he was down to like the wallpaper. Then out of nowhere, she says, "You remember your friend Joe from Chicago? He's thinking of killing himself. We have to call him." And they would call him, and he was, and they like saved his life. Then this is the story that really stood out for me, which is right before the channeling starts. She gets obsessed. She has this vision of a Lutheran church, and Bill and her flying to the Mayo Clinic, which I think was in Minnesota, Minneapolis, somewhere. And she's like, "I have to find this Lutheran church." And now she's getting, like, I realizes she might have psychic abilities. And in the beginning, she got tempted to use the psychic abilities for power very briefly. But that got corrected by when she started to channel. And she has a vision of this Lutheran church. They get out to the Mayo Clinic, and it's nighttime when they land, and she's like obsessed with finding this church. And Bill is like tired. He's pissed off. He's like, "Come on, we got a huge day tomorrow, Helen." And she's like, "I got to find this church." So she starts looking around. She starts looking up the church in the city and going to different churches, and none of them are it. She asked the taxi driver, like, "Have you seen this?" And she describes the church. Nothing. And she's like really frustrated. Like, what? They go to the Mayo Clinic, and they wanted them to look at their procedures and all the stuff at the Mayo Clinic. And when they're leaving, Bill goes, "Here's your church," and he shows her a newspaper of a Lutheran church. And it turns out the Mayo Clinic that they were at used to be a Lutheran church that got knocked down. And she's like, they're both looked at each other, and now Bill is like sitting up a bit straighter going, "This is strange." Now they go to the airport, and they see this young woman in the corner, like shell-shocked, like shaking. And Helen wants to go up to talk to her, and Bill is like, "Come on, Helen, we're going to start talking to strangers here. Like, we got to get home. We got a lot of work to do." Like, and he's a bit frustrated and tired. And Helen walks up, and this woman is super scared to go and fly. And she's just so PTSD, like panic-stricken. And Helen says, Liz starts to talk to her, and Helen says, "Why don't you sit next to us on the plane in between Bill and I? We'll take care of you." They hold her hand. Turns out she's Lutheran. She tells him she's flying to New York. She doesn't have she has $100 to her name. She doesn't have anyone to really take care of her, but she thought when she gets to New York, she'll find a Lutheran church. They take care of her. They put her up for a week. Helen, they're very resourceful. I mean, they're doctors at Columbia. They have money. Like, they put her up for a week. They take care of her. They feed her. They end up becoming super close with her. And Helen stays in touch with her for years. They fly her back. They like love her, stay in touch with her. Well, when she goes to help her on the plane, and like when this woman is in such panic, Helen hears like this, almost like a voice in her say, "And this is my church." And she's like a bit startled, like helping this woman is really my church, not the structure of the church that she had the vision of. Now, she's still freaked out by these psychic phenomena. And then basically one day it turns into a voice. Before this, she has a vision of her going into a cave and finding a scroll. And on the scroll, it says "God is" in the center. And on the left, there's writing, and on the right, there's writing. And the left, a voice says to her, if you look at the left, you could read the past. If you look at the right, you could read the future. And she then decides, I don't care about powers to see the future or the past. I just want to. She rolls the scroll up to just "God is" and takes the scroll. And now she gives up wanting any psychic powers or anything. And now suddenly this voice becomes super clear. And one day it says to her, "This is A Course in Miracles, take notes." And now she says to Bill, she's freaked out. She's like, and the voice was somewhat like almost not stern, like mad, but very direct. And I don't know I can't help myself to take notes. I already even when I'm writing, I don't even agree with any of this. This is this is not in my wheelhouse at all. In fact, I am very much against all of this. So you can imagine someone now who starts with an angry atheist channeling a voice. She channels it for 7 years. She said she had other revelatory experiences, but most of the time it was resistance, anger, frustration. Now, these cameos paint a very clear picture of her dialoguing that didn't make it in the course, which when I started to read it, it really deepened my relationship with the course and the material in a whole other way. And it almost made more of a personal relationship with this voice, which she then says, who is this? You know, they started to call the voice Jesus because it is the teaching of the Christ. And the course in a lot of the teaching, this is tough for people, especially, people that there's a lot of stuff from the Bible in there. The story of Judas, crucifixion, the resurrection, the garden, and there's talks about all that stuff, but it recontextualizes it significantly. And many Christians do not like it as a result of that. She wasn't really a Christian. I mean, there wasn't any of that stuff, which is why I think, she's like, she even said it, and you hear her talking to, let's say, Jesus, the voice, the Christ. I mean, she's like resisting right out of the gate. You hear her talking like, I think you picked the wrong person. I don't think you understand. Like, this, I'm not. And the voice would say to her, like, no, you're the perfect. You're just right for the job. She's like, why? Because you'll do it. And she said, and the voice was right, or if you want to say Jesus was right, I would do it, even though I was very reluctant and very anxious and didn't really want to do it. And now, 1,300 pages later, 1,300, I think it's exact, almost right around there, I forget exact, later. And I've read it all many times, There's other stories that we can go into specifically about this. So let's make this a part 1, because where we go to now next, I want to talk about some of these cameos and how impactful they were for me. And what these cameos did were themes. God is a theme. I Need Do Nothing is a theme, major themes in A Course in Miracles. And some of the things that made it in there are so profound that when you truly study it, there's no way Helen wrote it. It's very obvious. I've read her autobiography. Her writing is great. Not even close to on the level of the course. So now people are faced with a really deep question that I was faced with early on, coming from India. And it's very easy to, they've talked about enlightened siddhas and enlightened beings and all this stuff. Now you're faced with this. Is this really Jesus talking to her? And if it is, are you really listening? And then now, think about that. We have 1,300 plus pages of Jesus talking directly in a language we can understand. Whereas something like this isn't to say the Bible, there's great parts of the Bible too that line up. And I think Circle of Atonement did a great job of bringing them together in that way. But it also brings up this, could you imagine learning directly from Jesus? What does that open for our life? And it, not like Jesus like a savior, but Jesus like an older brother who finished the curriculum first and now is bridging it for all of us. Because the gap is so distant, especially with where we're at in the world right now with all the chaos. And there's been really no awakening yet of consciousness. Maybe we could say it's beginning in the last 100 years, 50, 100 years or so. That's all for interpretation. But if it truly is, then we're faced with this, okay, how good of a listener am I now? And that will stop right there for now as a preface. That'll be a part 1. And then part 2, I want to dive into some specific cameos.